Welcome everybody to the session. We're going to just allow a few more minutes for people to join, and then we'll officially start the session. Thank you. Okay, well, it's 1 minute past 5. I think we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to give you a warm November welcome from Trinity Business School, more specifically from our Center for Social Innovation. A welcome to this first event of our 2021-22 Business Ethics Speaker Series. My name is Daniel Milan, and I'm an assistant professor in business ethics at Trinity Business School. I'll be the moderator for the session. Before I explain the format of the event and introduce our guest speakers, it gives me great pleasure to ask our Dean, Professor Andrew Burke, to say a few words. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. I think I've morphed into a ghost-like form here as a result of changing rooms. Anyway, look, I first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to this new series, the 2021-22 series, and congratulate Daniel Mallon, Max Schomar, Kenneth Silver, indeed for organising an unbelievable seminar series, and indeed thanks to Mary-Lee Rhodes and the Centre for Social Innovation for hosting it. Like we've got an incredible line of speakers from South Africa, the Netherlands, the UK with Nottingham, Harvard, Arizona State University, and even a guest speaker that we tried to get here in the school many years ago, Paul Pullman. I suppose we've got the academic thought leaders, but also an industry thought leader, and it's great to see him on the seminar series too. So yeah, absolutely delighted, and I think this is a really important seminar series. I think today's topic is pretty apt. I think business schools have a huge duty in this area. First and foremost, before we even begin to preach or educate anyone else, we have to get our own house in order. I think if you look at how business schools operate and the amount of flights and the carbon footprint of the industry is off the scale. So we have to move to a more sustainable footing in terms of how we deliver our education and research, and that's going to be a challenge for all the schools internationally. And also we have a huge duty to make a massive impact. I mean, our research needs to address the core issues that public policy and industry and society needs answered in order to address particularly climate change, but also issues such as humane business and ethics generally. I think integrity is key right now, and also we need to do the same with our education program. So it's a huge challenge, and we not only have to guide the kind of the policy in terms of governance, in terms of the parameters that will nudge and limit business behavior, but we've also got to inspire our students to undertake the innovation and leadership to undertake that change in their industries and in their organizations, and importantly to lead consumers, because we know that if consumers demand that products are ethical, that are humane, sustainable, and so on, then even companies that don't buy into the whole ethics and arena it can only themselves sustain financially if they actually deliver products to meet those. So I think is really critical and a real key area that we can make a difference, especially as we've seen from the COP26, that we really can't rely on political leaders to lead this. And in fact, if the political leaders will respond if it comes from a ground up, if there's a movement of consumers and people. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to the seminar series, and particular to Piet's presentation. I think it's really apt to that. So I'll hand back to Daniel. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much, and thank you to both you and Mary-Lee for the support as well for this series. It was indeed about 18 months ago that Max and Kenneth and I started to put our heads together to get the first series off the ground. Max, by the way, became a father a couple of days ago. He's in Germany at the moment. We're delighted about that. And we also decided to simplify a little bit. So this year we're not going to have, you're not going to have our presence, all three of us, at all the events. We've also expanded the series to some of our colleagues that will moderate the sessions in a way to, get into the meat of things as quickly as possible. Because live music returned to Dublin, we've also discontinued the musical interludes, but that could change without notice in the future. And there's also a bit of a change in the format for the post-event social, which I will explain in a moment. But let's get to the event itself. Our guest speaker today is Professor Piet Naudé. Piet is Professor of Ethics and immediate past Director of the University of Stellenbosch Business School. And in the spirit of transparency that one would expect to see at a business ethics event, I have to declare that Piet is my former boss at the University of Stellenbosch. But he currently serves as Director of the EFMD Deans Across Frontiers Development Program, and is also a member of the International Academic Board of Católica Porto Business School in Portugal. The topic of the conversation this evening is his new book that has just been published by Springer, which he completed during his sabbatical as visiting Alexander von Humboldt Professor at the Technical University of Munich. And the book is titled Contemporary Management Education, 8 Questions that will shape its future in the 21st century. The format is going to be a virtual fireside chat, and I'm equally delighted to welcome Professor Mary-Lee Rhodes, co-director of our Center for Social Innovation and Associate Professor of Public Management here at Trinity College. Her research is focused on complex public service systems and the dynamics of performance, value, and impact. She has expertise in research, consulting, and management in the public and non-profit sectors, along with extensive private sector experience in banking and ICT management as well. So the format is that I'm going to hand over to Mary-Lee, and then we're going to have 30 minutes discussion between Mary-Lee and Piet. And then after that, we'll go into Q&A. But you're very welcome to post your questions in the Q&A at any time. The formal session, including the Q&A, will last for about an hour. And then similar to last year, we will have a social event afterwards. But this year, we're not going to give you a separate Zoom link. At the end of the session, we'll take a 5-minute break where you're invited to grab a cup or a glass of something during that time. And then when you come back, you should simply be able to switch on your cameras in this session and join us for that continued informal discussion, which we will cap at half an hour. You're welcome to join us for 5 or 10 minutes or stay the full half hour, but we'll have a hard sort of close at 6:30 Dublin time. So once again, Piet, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Mary-Lee. And I'm now going to hand over to Mary-Lee.
Thanks, Daniel, for that introduction and for inviting me to host this fireside chat with Professor Piet Naudé. I would not have come across this book, I don't think, without it, but it is an absolutely fascinating book for anyone who is in management education or indeed pondering the role of business in the world today in the 21st century. If you allow me, I'm going to put up a quick slide so people know a little bit about the book before we get talking about it. Maybe some of you have already read it, and if that's the case, I look forward to hearing your questions on it. But so this is a little overview of the book. That's the cover there, and it is published by Springer. And as you can see, the table of contents is essentially the 8 questions that Professor Naudé engages with throughout his book. And in fact, one of the wonderful things about this book is the way that he engages with them comes from not only a broad and really multidisciplinary approach to these questions, but also his own personal experience. And the chapters begin with a little vignette. Sometimes it's his own personal experience. Sometimes it appears to be something that is sort of a story or an allegory. And I absolutely recommend people from any background to get this if they're interested in what the role of business and indeed management education is. You can see the link there. It's also on the website. I know that Professor Naudé is not here to market the book, but I certainly would recommend that you take a look at it, because not only is it a wonderfully interesting and a tour de force, but you can also just get one chapter if you choose. If you're really interested in the question of inequality and management, you can just buy one chapter. And also, I would say buy the whole book, because the other wonderful thing about it is that it's only 129 pages. So I think that is really impressive in this, in the world of books that might be written on your sabbatical. To get it to 129 pages suggests that you had a lot of this all ready to go, and you were able to bring it down into its essence, which is tremendous. So I think with that, you can see the 8 questions here. I'm not going to go through them in order. There's some that I'll pick out, but I of course invite Professor Naudé or indeed the audience to raise questions on it. So you might want to take a little screenshot there to remind you if there's something there that you want to ask about, and indeed the link is there as well. So let me just get out of that, stop sharing my screen, and get out of that so I can see what I'm doing. And now we're back to the fireside chat. So with that, I might just invite Professor Naudé to tell us, why did you write this book?
Hi, Mary-Lee, thank you, and to Daniel and the Dean, Andrew, for this opportunity. Please call me Piet as well. I'm quite comfortable with that. Yeah, why? Just say the brevity of the book is because I wrote a newspaper column for 10 years. And the editor was very clear: if you can't say something well in 800 words, then probably you don't understand it yourself. So it was a little bit with that background. Why did I write the book? I've been, from a very young age, Mary-Lee, I've been privileged to serve in, shall I say, university settings as a head of department, the dean of a faculty, a vice rector of a university. And in that process, you face certain issues. And I grew into a habit to try and think through those issues. So many of the issues, although they, for management education, and you've seen it in the book, it's broader about, higher education as such. So the first reason why I wrote the book is because it's part of my habit to be reflective about the issues that face us, whether it's colonization or exclusion or climate change, whatever. The second issue is that 2 of the chapters, Mary-Lee, directly comes from the COVID crisis. The one on technology, because suddenly all of our teaching was changed over. We had to be retrained to do this kind of stuff that we never did before, and so forth. And I just had to quickly ask myself, do we know what we embrace, as you see in chapter, I think 7, when we embrace technology, and just put up a few red flags there. And the other one, obvious, is the last chapter, is the black swan. What does leadership mean in a black swan event? And then perhaps a last reason, more not on the ideology, the origin of the book, but more why, for the purpose, is I want to make it very, very clear. This is, in my view, a very strong apologetics for the role of humanities in management education. I'm a linguist, studied 7 languages. I'm a philosopher with a master's in philosophy. I know a bit of sociology. I've got a PhD in systematic theology. It's not the kind of stuff that you would find in a business school. And by the way, in my interview for the directorship of Stellenbosch, the question was raised, why are you even here? I mean, what are you doing here? And I think, Mary-Lee, I deliberately put forward my hat as a humanities scholar to convince those guys that call themselves, we are in the hard subjects and ethics and the other stuff in the soft subject, that in fact they're wrong. The hard stuff is the tough questions that I try to address in the book. Sorry, that's a long question.
That's wonderful, because I think one of the things we have struggled, or not struggled with, but been a part of our DNA in the business school here in Trinity is a very strong link, certainly at the undergraduate level, with the School of Social Sciences, not as much in the humanities. We sort of sociology, political science, indeed philosophy are kind of part of our vision of the social sciences, but I think it's a really important part of management education, indeed any education, to have that part. So you're bringing a broad perspective, and in the end, you write 129 pages about 8 questions. So it's not that there's only 8 questions out there. How did you decide on these 8 questions?
Yeah, well, let me first say, when I went into my sabbatical, I had to, tell the university what will I do, and obviously they only granted, like probably at Trinity 2, on the basis of a proper proposal, and so it was not something that I planned long in advance and say, okay, now I've got 1 question, please add a second one. I can be very honest with you, Mary-Lee, it took me less than 30 minutes to identify these 8 questions very early on in my sabbatical, probably October last year. And the reason was some of it is work that I've already done, half. When you're in a management position like the dean and perhaps yourself, your writing time is very short. You start something and put it down in the drawer, and then in the sabbatical, you pull them out. But there is a certain logic about them. The first 3 questions are looking inwardly and say, who are we? Why are we so important? What value do we add and what good do we produce? And those are tough questions in themselves. The following 2 questions has to do with our effect going outward. How do we exclude people? Because in my view, we promote economic inequality. And how do we become part of a colonization project? The effect of colonization specifically for us from the South. And then the next 2 questions has to do with 2 factors that from the outward affect us inwardly, namely technology and climate change. And the last one is obviously, how do we think about all these things from a leadership perspective? So the questions came ad hoc from different perspectives, but I had to put them together in one go. And I had to sort of afterward construct the logic of the book. Otherwise, it's just a lot of flags in the air and there's no coherence. But that's the way it started.
Okay, I mean, as you describe it, I could almost link it to a strategic analysis of the environment, your internal capacities, challenges, etc. So I'm good with it. I'm good with it. Having said that, it is quite unusual to have, in my experience, to have chapters on colonization, not to mention equality, in a management education book. And, conscious that my surname suggests I should be careful about asking this question of a South African, how is colonization related to management and management education? Can you go into that a bit?
Yeah, the reason is simply that Harvard dominates the world. I mean, the case studies from there, the professors from there, the ideas from there. Harvard as a metaphor for what I would call the Eurocentric West. And if you do, and I've done it in a footnote in my book, if you try and write the thought history of management education, and it's a very young science, it's not even probably 105, 110 years old. I couldn't find a single woman that has an enduring influence where you would find her prescribed works, like you would find, creating shared value, strategic management, the purpose of business is, making money, Friedman. And secondly, all of them male and all of them European. So, and if you then look the origin of the MBA and how it spread across the world, it became transplanted in its original form in different geographical contexts, but the paradigm never changed. So when I sit in South Africa and study management education, I don't even know that I'm introduced into a very specific paradigm. That is because it becomes the norm. It is the way you see things. Now, the only way why a person like me can write about it, because I suffer from it. But you guys in Dublin, because you're part of the center, the periphery is just out of your sight. It's not because you're bad people, it's the way paradigms work. I mean, Thomas Kuhn is very clear. A paradigm is a community construction of reality. And that is the way you view that. And may I yes say, Mary-Lee, I also have personal, if I may call it, suffering under decolonization. Let me explain why. Whenever I'm invited to speak at business education conferences, and I did relay this in the book as well. You know, we talk about racism and sexism and classism. I think colonization has brought us regionalism. So they would have the guy from Harvard, it can be Trinity, as a metaphor again, to introduce the topic. Let's say leadership in management education. John will speak from Harvard. And then the next is to say, Piet Naudé will speak and he will bring the African perspective. And then Carlos dos Santos will bring the Latin American perspective. As if our voice can never address the issue from a so-called global perspective. We're always the regional guys. Now, that is a very subtle way in which you reinforce the dominance. Quickly on inequality, I live in the most unequal society in the world, measured by the Gini coefficient. I see the devastating effect of excluding people from educational opportunities at school level, at secondary school level, and absolutely devastating at tertiary level, at university level. It pains my heart to see that we've created a system where the privileged are again allowed into the system. They come into our schools, our prices are high. You can't be poor if you do an MBA. And then we send them out in the world to proceed with that privilege. And what we in the end do, we simply continue what I would call a very, very unfair and unethical system. And I don't have to tell you that Piketty has clearly showed us the figures behind this. This is not an ideological view, it's an empirical.
No, I know. And I think it's one of the things, I think combining that with the climate crisis, those two bits to address what's happening to the planet and what's happening to the divisions and the inequality between us would be a major contribution, which brings me to the question of the purpose of business. So I'm channeling, I'm channeling Milton Friedman and saying that, much of, and your book addresses it as well, is that much of the literature, many of the models, the way we equip our students to go out into the world and practice business is to do it in a very narrow, frame, in that our job is to create value, mostly for the shareholders, maybe also for the customers, not to treat our employees badly, but essentially, and then possibly to have a sort of a wider awareness of our impact on society. Your chapter, well, certainly your chapter 2, but other places suggests that even some of the more, if you want to call them more wider perspectives, purpose of business, don't really get us out of that. Can you talk a little bit about this and maybe how we dig ourselves out of that?
Yeah, well, I must say that chapter is intellectually probably the most controversial one, because I take on the big giants, and I think they'll have to respond if they want to. Probably they won't read it because I'm not that important. But the point is, the people who heavily criticize Milton Friedman are all Friedmanians. They just couch it in different language. So they say, oh, it's no longer shareholders, it's stakeholders. But the purpose of business is to optimize shareholder value by engaging the stakeholders. Then they say, no, we need a new form of capitalism. Porter and Kramer, right there in the Harvard Business Review. It's all a lie. I mean, if you read that piece, it is an absolute intellectual dishonest piece, because it says the primacy of profit for the shareholder remains. The only thing now is we buy that with some social goodwill by engaging in what he would call creating social value or shared value. But if you really start to analyze what really counts at shared value, it's very, very clear that not the big social problems of the day will count in, because they cannot be commodified. And if something cannot be commodified, then obviously it doesn't count for business. So I would say that, let me answer your question from the other perspective. I believe whatever the objective of business is to make a profit. I mean, in private business, if you don't make a profit, I mean, why are you doing it? I'll be clear, I'm not anti-capitalist. I'm not anti-individual entrepreneurship. I'm not anti-innovation. I mean, this is what brought us enormous wealth in the world. We should just distribute it a bit better. And millions of people, in fact, if you add China in, billions of people have been lifted out of poverty by allowing people the freedom of their own choice. So no doubt about that. But I would put two, what I would call intrinsic values down. And that is human dignity and ecological integrity. If you overstep any one of those two, I don't mind what your purpose is, then you are not good for society. And I put that down in my chapter, and let me stop there. So I would say whatever your overall purpose of business is, apart from the objective of making profit, it should be subject to those two constraints, and they are tough constraints. They are not easy to handle, and I'm not idealistic here, Mary-Lee, to say, you know, all businesses will be perfect human rights defenders. If you, the moment you go into China and do business there and make a lot of money, you're already complicit in some human rights and privacy issues. I mean, you must understand that. The question is, how do you deal with that? So that would be my response. The most abused word in business and in management education is the word value, because it seems to take on all sorts of interesting meanings, but it always means monetary value. And that is so sad. It is very, very sad.
Yes, well, a discussion of values is certainly one that when you sit down in a business class and you're trying to talk about value, you could spend the whole module talking about how do we define the phrase value? And hopefully people have taken some of the humanities and philosophy, et cetera, so that they could engage productively in that. I think I'm going to come back to it, because there was something you said that twigged another thing that when I was reading it, I wanted to ask you to maybe explain it a bit more or talk a bit more about it, because not only do you challenge in some ways the idea that some of these newer approaches to the purpose of business are somehow solving the problem of the damage business creates, but you also challenge this idea of sustainability. Yeah, I think, and that's really interesting, because you said the word, the second, I think, if I understood you correctly, the second basic principle that we can't go outside of and still be ethical is ecological integrity, which is different from, I think, what you mean by sustainability. Could you talk
Absolutely.
about that?
No. Sustainability talk, the same with stakeholder talk, is wrong. It leads you exactly in the direction where you try to get away from. And the reason is simple. The word sustainability, as in the famous Brundtland report in 1987, was defined as, you know, the ability of the way to deal with our limited resources now, so that the human needs of future generations will not be compromised. Now, I mean, that was a breakthrough thinking in 1987. But now that we know a little bit better what we've done with climate change, that is extremely wrong in two senses. Number one is human need satisfaction remain the basis of your decisions. And secondly, your reference for action is only anthropocentric. It's only human needs that count, and all other species are excluded. So I would I like the word sustainability. It was fantastic in 1987. I would replace it today with ecological integrity. And obviously one has to do a little bit of work to define that. Because unless sustainability means the decentering of the human subject and the human needs, forget it. We will not change.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think that's a really helpful reframing of the concept of sustainability, because I do think we use the Brundtland report and the definition as a jumping off place for a lot of the work we talk about. And I think you absolutely highlighted a real weakness in the centering of human needs on the planet. You know, just like value, shareholder value is facilitated by the fact that we've made customers happy, or we've done something with integrating communities. It's all about shareholder value, and sustainability is all about human needs. Well,
exactly. As long, you know, I in the book somewhere write about the interesting legal developments, where in New Zealand both a mountain and a river were accorded legal status. On the insistence of the Maori or indigenous peoples. And it took them more than 100 years of many court cases to come to that point. And I think you've read it perhaps, Mary-Ann. And the reason is simple. If you come from an indigenous population, I don't want to romanticize it. I live in Africa. I know what indigenous means. But you either look at a mountain as a source of glory, a source of ancestor remembrance, a source of inspiration for whom you have to care, or you look at it as a tourist attraction that you must exploit. That's the difference. In the first one, your own needs are subject to the integrity of the object, if I might call it an object. In the second, it's the human need becomes the driving force, and if you put money to it, the environment will always lose.
So, I mean, let's talk about management, how this translates to how we as educators will, number one, act or change things, or number two, some of the barriers we might face. I mean, you did say you thought that the chapter about purpose is going to be the most, controversial or difficult. Frankly, I think the chapter about ecology, where you actually are talking to a tree. Yeah. And I think that's going to be, it's very compelling when you talk about it, but I think that is going to be one of the challenges, at least that's when I read it. One of the challenges trying to bring this into education isn't going to be a kind of a fair debate about whether purpose is this or purpose is that, but actually bringing things in that people think don't belong there. I mean, how do you see us doing that? Yeah.
No, let me stick into the inequality issue. That was for me the most difficult chapter to write, Mary-Lee. I tell you why. I had a hunch that we're part of an exclusive club, but I wanted to prove it. Now, conceptually, I can do that. It's not, I'm strong on concepts, but just I'm bad with figures, man. Daniel will know. Our school did well, but I had good people around me. But that is the most empirical of all my chapters, because I had to draw on Piketty's analysis of exactly how distribution of income works, the question of income inequality. And a very important point that we all in universities, and I'm in universities for 30 years, we believe that we are great institutions in society. The reason is why? Because we provide upward social mobility for those who are previously excluded. Well, good luck. The fact is that we are in fact inhibitors and contributors to inequality. Now, let me not argue my case. You can read the chapter with all the figures. I've included a beautiful South African story, which I found very moving, how difficult it is for a Black woman South African from a rural area to come to USB. Your chances are probably 1.4, 1.5%. Okay, that's what. How do we change that? Mary-Lee, firstly, unless we change our recruitment and access policies, nothing will change. And I was so delighted, and I'm here not to market a specific university, but when the Faculty of Commerce at Stellenbosch University realized that we are basically the place where rich white alumni send their children. They have the money to pay. They went to good enough schools, so their grades are good enough, and they will come in. If we simply let the system go on, we will simply perpetuate intergenerational prosperity and at the same time intergenerational deficits. So what did we do? We said, obviously, guys, we don't want to chase away our best students, but what we must do is in our recruitment and in our decision of how to get a student in, we'll have to expand the criteria. And then we use typically South African markers that are really good as social indicators. Which school did you attend? And are you first generation university? Aha, that's a different story. So now the tablet from which you look to let students into the system suddenly allow for bright students who are first generation, but whose grades are perhaps not that good because they were been in what we would call a tier 1 or tier 2 school, which are normally very, very weakly, with infrastructure and so forth. And suddenly, our first year classes start to change. Suddenly, in a cohort of 4 to 5 years, your final years look differently, and suddenly your access to the honors become differently. And so it is a long-term thing. And you have bursaries for underfunded students, not half bursaries. Don't give people, money for accommodation. You have to give them full bursaries so that they can. That's the one thing. Secondly, business schools, and here I'm very critical, is we are ourselves businesses, and we act in ways that say, I want to be the best. I compete with everybody and I want to be at the top. I'm number 6 on this list and I'm number 12 on that list. That spirit, we've got empirical evidence, spreads into the students' minds, and we've got very, very good research to show that if students are exposed to this economizing thinking, they adapt it. So this is the second thing. And lastly, we have to send them out with a different mindset. And we don't have students for long, but I believe, and there I'm very naive, I'm a strong believer that you can change students' paradigm. It relies on us to do it. They can be 18 years old or in the MBA 32 years old, they can change. And we've got that levers in our hands.
Yeah. We might come back to that if we have time, because I'd love to chat with you about what you're finding as you introduce that. We've been having a process we're now calling Pathways to Business. It was used to call Trinity Access Program. And we're finding beyond beyond making an education accessible and beyond giving some extra educational supports, which we're actually we can take that in. There's a number of other things. The bursaries are one of the major ones, but we might come back to that in more detail if we have time, because I don't want to keep others from being able to ask questions. I'm just going to check with Daniel to see where we are now, if I should stop. I have many things to discuss with Piet, but if this is the right point to kind of maybe come to the Q&A, or should I keep asking my questions?
Mary-Lee, I think you can perhaps ask 1 or 2 more, but we can also start looking at the questions in the Q&A. There are 3 that have come in, comments or questions. So I think both you and Piet can see the questions, so perhaps you can have a look at that. But we still have 20 minutes.
Okay, well then what I'm going to do maybe is have one more on another topic that we haven't quite touched upon yet. And I think it's one that you mentioned to me, and I know this is something you told me, is that you said that you'd written this quite quickly, but chapter 8, I think, was one that you wrote particularly quickly, the leadership one. And I know that you felt like this was one you wrote really quickly. I actually found it really compelling, because it felt very much like a person, a normal person, not a leadership scholar.
Oh, so the rest I was abnormal. Oh my word.
Yeah,
Okay.
the other ones you were sort of scholarly and that sort of stuff. But this was a person who really was a practitioner. So a thoughtful practitioner trying to organize their thoughts about what makes kind of a good leader. And you framed it with these 4 intelligences, which is where you kind of went off on a more of a scholarly thing. But can you talk a little bit about these 4 intelligences, and maybe which ones, or one, you think is really one that many business people or many business students really should work on?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Mary-Lee. I thought it clearly, for me, it's the weakest chapter in the book because it's academically not very strong, but it does speak to a reality at that point. And I think what you tell me, and I take that as a great compliment, is that in the text itself, you can see that I'm in it. You know, I'm struggling. This is not easy. So I would say the two, and you know, I use a bit of business language, you know, emotional intelligence and blah, blah, blah. Don't like that very much, but okay. I think the two that for me stand out is the emphatic intelligence, the question of empathy and vulnerability. You know, I'm so sick and tired of this idea of leaders being great and visionary and strong and sharp and up there and, you know, have so many followers. We are all just normal human beings. And what many leaders forget is that if you always project this sort of fantastic attitude of this great person who's unaffected by the world, you become almost unhuman or suprahuman, and people want to be led by humans. And I have had many really moving occasions in my own life where people came into my office and we could just sit on the bench and sometimes even cry together because life is not easy. So I think that is something that one must work on. I'm not talking about, you know, a weakness at the wrong time. In the book, I explained that a bit. And the other one is the issue about, which links up with my transcendent good, which I think is a fantastic concept in the goods chapter. It links up with what I would call the futuring intelligence. Mary-Lee, COVID, climate change, rising of nationalisms, the world is not a nice place at the moment. And people start to sort of, it's like a curtain that comes before your face. They turn inward, they migrate inward, and we really need leaders with the ability to still dream about alternatives that are good and to which we can work collectively. And, you know, I always said to people, when you drive up to USB, it's slightly on a hill, you drive up here to see wider and to see better. And when you go out here to have hope. And I think management education is a fantastic opportunity for us. We are so privileged to work with the people that we work with, to provide this empathetic leadership, but also the one with futuring intelligence.
And interesting, the futuring intelligence was one that also I flagged as something that could be raise some questions in how people are seeing what is a way to teach people about how to be in the world. So there's a lot of kind of recommendations, perspectives that we need to be in the now. We need to be able to be fully human, to be fully able to express ourselves, but also to be able to experience being a human being. We need to be in the now. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating that you built on Heidegger and Bosch in this. Again, really a fun read, can I just say, for anyone who is interested in a wide range of things. So this idea that you need to experience the now to be effective in your own life, but also in the wider life. But your futuring really talks that leaders need to have a vision of the future and builds on hope, which of course in some religions, or at least the one that I know in the Buddhist religion, hope is not seen as a positive way to come to life.
Yes.
How do you, how are you squaring those circles? How do you work with that?
Yeah, you know, bad religion sell you hope as a pie in the sky when you die. A good religion, and may I say some of the best works in Christian theology on hope, if you want to push me there, Jürgen Moltmann and others, building on the philosophers of the late, you see, I refer to the question of the very important role of imagination in all of this. Then it is not something that is somewhere in the future, and I just hope that I will get there. I mean, this is nonsense. It doesn't work like that. What happens is, if you have this alternative future, it infuses the energy in yourself exactly to face the current situation and create a situation what I would call hope against hope. Now, that is only possible, Mary-Lee, if the picture, the imaginative other reality are an infusing energetic force to face the challenges of today. It's not a way out, it's a way in.
Okay, good, thank you. That's helpful, because those kinds of discussions, when you're really trying to make your way to an alternative perspective to view business, it is something, it's hard work.
Very, very hard work.
Yeah.
But you know, you can look, there are fantastic examples in real business worlds out there. I mean, let me not name him now, where leaders exactly did that. Against all odds, they saw a different future, came back and just pushed, and it happened. It can happen. So it's not unrealistic to hope.
Okay, well, I think at this point now, given the time, I think I might try to bring in one or more of the questions that we have, and there's a really fundamental one here that are some coming from Charles Sherwood. What do you think of the concept of business ethics as something that somehow is a separate set of rules, or something separate from human ethics? What is the difference there? Or do you think there is a difference? Is this a useful concept?
No, it's a useful concept because of simply the discipline of ethics. Obviously, you've got meta ethics, a reflection on concepts, what is justice, what is good, blah blah blah. Then you've got ethical theories, deontology, utilitarianism, blah blah blah, and then you have what we call applied ethics. Now, business ethics draws on both the meta and the theoretical reflections, which are common across the whole of humanity and all of society. But you can't have the same reflection on ethics in medicine, where you talk about, is vaccination an ethical thing to force upon people? That's a different question from, should a business be environmentally conscious? So I think it's still useful, but the question is right. It's not something special in a corner. It derives its roots from a broad humane thinking about what is good, but it applies it to the specific questions of business as you would apply it to the specific questions of mining companies or financial or whatever the case might be. Still useful.
And that's I think a nice kind of lead into some other questions about something that's specific to ethics. Or to business. You've already talked about access and inequality. And usually that's taught in sort of policy and sociology, larger questions, not so much as something that business is involved in, but clearly you've talked about and demonstrated in the book that it is something business is quite a huge part of. And business schools, you've already said how business schools could do things by opening their doors to a wider set of people, or going out to actually find those people and bring them in to the business school, but while they're in there. So the question here from Ramesh Krishnan is, well, it's not so much a question, is how do we balance, how do we bring up or bring into this community people whose either their original education, their access to funds, their family support systems, indeed their internet connection. How do you actually create the conditions within which this wider set of people could access this kind of education?
Let me just make this clear, Mary-Lee. I've been an administrator and leader in higher education long enough to also understand and the limits of higher education. I mean, it's impossible for a university in South Africa to change the secondary school system, which is the real feeding ground for first-year students. I mean, we cannot run 100 schools. We've got enough to do. So there are certain things about which you can lobby for it, you can do research on it, you can advise the educational authorities on it, and that is your job. I mean, it's important that we do change it on the level of thinking and policy and research. But I cannot provide broadband internet to every student in the rural Transkei of South Africa. I simply don't have those resources available. So I tend to say you have to have a double focus. One is on the things that you cannot really make a material difference, at least make an intellectual difference. Push the debate, fight with the politicians, put in proposals for new legislation. But what you can control, please do something about that. For instance, when the COVID hit us, we don't have that many students. We were able to provide every single student enrolled at our university with a laptop, with data loaded with funds that we provide under certain conditions and control, and was able to do that. So we acted within the emergency, within the means that we have. Second point I want to make is, and there my colleague that asked the question is right, the homogeneity in our classes are scary. The reason is we are so homogeneous. The whole management education system, although we have people from all over the world, don't think geography make you different, because it's all about the intellectual paradigm. And that's a sad thing. We have too few diverse voices in this whole system to allow other voices to be heard. I've been in many classes. They have to start to trust you. You have to walk a road with them. And then you have to look, where are those who are normally not in the forefront, and started to create spaces for them. And I'm telling you, I had the most fantastic experiences where specifically women from poor backgrounds would stand up in a class. Their English are not as eloquent, but they're not stupid. They're very sharp. They simply didn't have the same opportunities. And then they say, my voice was not heard before, but I feel welcome here. It's good to be here. That's what we can do.
I have to say, I mean, I think there are some basic human things that we can do and sensitize our lecturers, our administrators, people in the university to just making that space for people to feel like they're welcome here. One of the things it's constantly raised to us, and we've worked to change it, is that Trinity as a university is basically enclosed in a giant wall. And there are entrances, but they're kind of guarded. And that is a huge metaphor for people, and not even a metaphor, it's a reality that you're not welcome here unless somehow you can pass the gate. And like opening it up and having new entrances. We had a big battle, not a battle, that's the wrong word. We had to hold our ground to have another entrance into the business school from a road that was, you know, seen as not necessarily the greatest road, the greatest street in the city. Then do we create security problems if we had an entrance there?
Exactly.
And that's hugely important.
Yeah, you know, we are all very sharp to speak up about racism. I'm a white privileged male. I know my own background. The apartheid education that I had put me in a very privileged position, and you have to acknowledge that and understand that racism is something deep in your blood. You can intellectually get around it, but existentially it's there. Now, the one that really haunts me is classism. The way we see people that are lower on the socioeconomic or educational scale, and I draw on the work in my book about this attitude of you know, what I have is what I earn. But what you don't know is you've built on a massive, massive unseen infrastructure that you didn't even know is there. You only miss it when it's missing. And that is a problem. We look upon people through the lenses of classism, and then we put them in categories, and those categories means you're not welcome here. You're not welcome.
I'm going to bring you, I mean, I think, again, I'm conscious that I want to make sure I honor all the people that have put in questions, and there's two here. One's kind of started it off, and then somebody brought in a connected question. So from Josephine Matthews, she's just looking for a little bit more clarification of what you mean by ecological integrity. And so her example was, does it mean, for example, at a minimum, planetary boundary, test for fitness? What you have any things that you kind of link that concept to? And as well, obviously the other one, human dignity, and she gives an example of I mean, you can see it here, but then Sandra, but then Sandra says, okay, once you have those definitions, well, what do you do with them in your curriculum design? So that's a huge set of questions. And I'm just gonna fling it over to you and see what you can do.
You know, let me start with the curriculum side. I learned from feminist scholars that why are feminist views not in the curriculum? The answer is simple, because those who write the curriculum don't see that as important. So the change, a curriculum change, Mary-Lee, doesn't start when you have a workshop on curriculum change. That's too late. It starts by changing the mindsets. Who is involved in the construction of that curriculum? Whom do you invite as a voice into that curriculum? And may I put my cards on the table? The created order is a voice. They can't speak like we speak. And in my little metaphorical introduction to my chapter on ecology, you see my interaction with a big tree. They speak. We are just too stupid to understand them. But because they don't speak our language, they are not heard. So I put my cards on the table. Many curriculum redesign processes are, you know, shifting the chairs on the deck, and suddenly you call it something different and then it looks fantastic. It's the same boat. That's the question. Question of ecological integrity. I can give you a long talk on why I use those specific words. I will not do that now. I am very conscious, Mary-Lee, and also the person that asked the question. We cannot move to full ecological integrity in a fossil fuel economy overnight. It's impossible. But the pace is far too slow. And the young people at COP, just close to you now, spoke about that. We've got all the different groups talking about this. So I would say an oil exploration company that says, I like to take on board the intrinsic value of ecological integrity, have to think very carefully about what they plan for their own future. And the banks that finance them have to think very carefully what projects that they want to. Because unless you push the money in a different direction, things will not change. And you need time for that transition. But the problem is, we appoint people on 5-year incentive contracts. And you saw my story in the book. I went into Sasol, a very famous South African fossil fuel company. The first question I asked them, what proportion of your budget is spent on the possibility that Sasol can become one of the greatest renewable energy companies in the world? Ha ha ha, they laugh at me. Professor Naudé, I can see you're an academic. You don't understand how it works. Our pay is 60% basic pay and 40% performance related. Do you want me to give up my performance now for something that will happen 30 years down the line? You don't understand how business works. That's the problem. Short-termism, reward systems all work in one direction. Don't take ecological integrity seriously. That's somebody else's problem. Greta will talk again and say blah, 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 blah. She's probably right. Then this quick one on human dignity, carefully chosen, not human rights. That's a legal concept. You can treat everybody perfectly according to the law, but still impede their dignity. It's a slightly more ethical, moral concept, because my dignity has to do with my private space, the person who I am, my own identity, and to be granted the individuality that I am. And that is something more. It's not less, but it's definitely something more than respecting my human rights.
Thank you for that. I see that Daniel has appeared as if by magic on the top. Does that mean that we're moving to a shift in our dialectic?
Yes, we have to, Mary-Lee, because some people have other commitments starting, on the hour. So it's time to wrap up and to transition to the next part. Before I thank you and Piet, let me just quickly remind you and invite all our attendees to visit the Trinity website to look at the information about the series as it will unfold. The next event is on the 2nd of December, when our colleague Martha O'Hagan-Luff will host Professor Dirk Schoenmaker from Rotterdam School of Management. Oh. He'll talk about sustainability, transitions and investments, Piet. So perhaps you should register and make a few points about ecological integrity during that session. And then my colleague Max will start us off next year on the 20th of January with Professor Julie Batilana from Harvard, with a talk on power for all, how it really works and why it's everyone's business. and the special event on the 3rd of February, which will be hosted jointly with the Mendoza School of Business at Notre Dame, with Paul Pullman of Unilever, former CEO of Unilever, and also the executive director of the UN Global Compact that will join us for that session. But let me just say thank you very much to both Piet and Mary-Lee. On the cover of the book, Tom Donaldson, who was one of our speakers last year, said, an amazing read. Piet Naudé is eclectic and sparkling. He applies his talents to the wicked maze of management education. No issue is more important for global business. No writer is better qualified. And because I don't have to impress you anymore, I can say I echo that. It was really wonderful to have you. And then Mary-Lee, with your experience in public management, social innovation, can't think of anybody better to open up this conversation and to have the chat. So once again, thank you to both of you. It is exactly 6 o'clock now in Dublin, so we're going to take a 5-minute break. And then I can already see some people joining us. Please switch on your cameras, grab a drink if you want to. And then at 5 minutes past the hour, we're going to open up the conversation and just continue for a while. So thanks again to everybody, and see hopefully many of you soon. Thank you and bye-bye.